Point of order, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I seek the leave of the House to table a transcript just put together by the New Zealand First Office from a comment made on the 29th of July 2015 during question time at question number 1, where the Speaker of this House said, quote, shut up, Winston.
No, look, if that is, no, that will be, if that is the case, that information will be public knowledge now because it will be in Hansard. And it's in the public domain. So I'm not going to accept that leave, that application for leave. I'm calling the next speaker. Well, if you're going to relitigate what I've already ruled on, Mr. Mark, that's a serious matter. New point of order?
Yeah, new point of order.
Ron Mark, point of order.
This transcript is not in the public domain, Mr. Speaker. I've just brought it to the House.
If that statement was made in the House, it's in Hansard and it is in the public domain. I call Kevin Haig.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker, tēnā koutou te whare. There is a whakatauki that probably appears most frequently in speeches in this House and from ministers outside it. He aha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if instead of saying he tangata 3 times, we should be saying it 29 times. As a reminder, Mr. Speaker, of the 29 lives lost in the Pike River disaster. We were reminded by the memorial out at the cenotaph yesterday evening of those lives lost, which in a sense was the genesis of this bill. I've lost count of the times, Mr. Speaker, since the Pike River disaster that I've heard members of Parliament and ministers saying that we owe it to the memory of those men who were lost and to their families to ensure that that kind of disaster can never recur. Mr. Speaker, or perhaps we should be saying he tangata 291 times, reflecting the 291 people who have perished in their workplaces since the Pike River disaster. Mr. Speaker, these lives are precious, and there is nothing more important, no more important responsibility of government than to protect our citizens, a responsibility that this government is currently failing and proposes to fail further. Over the decades, Mr. Speaker, it has been a familiar refrain from employers that they know best, and the way to ensure health and safety in the workplace is to leave it to them, because they'll be able to tailor a regime that suits their particular workplace and their particular workers. Well, Mr. Speaker, there are good employers and there are bad employers. And the job of legislation, the job of government, is to set a minimum standard, a minimum requirement that even bad employers cannot get away with less. In the 1990s, the government of the day agreed with what the employers had asked for, to leave it to them, and they deregulated. Despite the clarity of the message at the time in response to that, that deregulation of health and safety would lead to unnecessary deaths in the workplace. I've said in the House several times in relation to the Pike River disaster and the various pieces of legislation we've considered subsequently, pointed out that standard economic theory says that firms will seek to minimise their costs by any means that's available to them legally. And that includes cutting corners on health and safety if they are able to do so. And at Pike River, and in literally hundreds of other workplaces, that is precisely what a deregulated health and safety regime allowed bad employers to do. So, Mr. Speaker, we were pleased when the government introduced this bill because it was a great step forward from the regime that existed previously. It wasn't a perfect bill by any means, But it was a step forward. Unfortunately, the government has once again caved to the case made by bad employers. And as a result of that, we are changing our vote today, and the Green Party will vote against this bill. We hope that there will be changes made in the Committee of the Whole House that enable us to once again support this bill. Some of the specific issues, and we'll deal with many specific issues in the committee stage, but some that we want to refer to now. The biggest, I think, is probably the exemption that the government intends to grant for workplaces of under 20 people. If people are truly at the heart of the policy, then we need to see the policy from the perspective of those whom we're trying to protect, the people who are the workers who go to work in their workplaces. And a person's right to go to work, be safe in that workplace, and then come home to their family is no different in a workplace of fewer than 20 employees than a workplace with more. Minister and the government will no doubt argue that that right of those workers needs to be compromised to avoid unnecessary or disproportionate compliance costs for small employers. Mr. Speaker, I used to be an employer in a small business place, in a variety of them in fact, and while I certainly had some gripes about compliance costs, health and safety compliance costs were absolutely never one of those. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry, Moby, has taken the extraordinary initiative, it seems to me, of in fact putting up on its website some information to dispel the mythology around this kind of rhetoric that has been presented from a small group of bad employers. Not only, Mr. Speaker, is there no reason not to protect workers in small workplaces to the same extent as we might do in larger ones, in fact, it's arguable that there is more reason to do so. Because, Mr. Speaker, the international evidence, the New Zealand evidence is not currently strong enough either way, but the international evidence, in particular from the United States, makes it clear that in general, smaller workplaces are in fact less safe than larger ones. So the government's move to water down the obligations of employers in smaller workplaces actually places less protection on the workers whom we expect to be at greater risk. We have some specific concerns about the treatment of work groups in the bill. Health and safety representatives are there to represent workers. But what the bill enables employers to do is deem a particular work group whom these representatives will represent. In other words, it will be employers who decide which workers representatives represent, not the workers themselves. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a travesty of the very idea of representation. It may be a drafting error, in which case I look forward to the Minister's SOP on that matter. We're concerned about the situation of home support workers, people who will be, by definition, in very small workplaces, and it appears under this legislation that essentially nobody will be responsible for the obligations that employers have under this legislation. Again, a travesty in relation to some of the most vulnerable workers in our country. And Mr. Speaker, we'll raise other matters in the Committee of the Whole House. Members will recall that this bill has arisen pretty directly out of the report of the Royal Commission on the Pike River tragedy and from the report of the Independent Task Force. And both of those entities recommended sweeping changes. They said that New Zealand's health and safety law was entirely inadequate and both focused on all employers, Mr. Speaker, not just some. They both said that major reform was required, that greater worker engagement was essential, and they both heard and retailed evidence that unions were essential as worker representatives. They both proposed alignment with jurisdictions that had better health and safety records than New Zealand, and in particular Australia. And the regime that the original bill proposed was precisely what Australia has, and it works there. No reason, in fact, to change it. One of the sections in this report of the Royal Commission on the Pike River disaster is entitled Failure to Learn the Lessons of History. And Mr. Speaker, as Sue Moroney has already spoken about in this House, that seems to be precisely the route that we are now proceeding with. I recall that when I asked the Prime Minister on the 8th of November 2012 whether he accepted that deregulation, as the Royal Commission had said, had caused a disaster, he said no. And now we see a bill that reflects the Prime Minister.
I'm calling Clayton Mitchell.